Hello, everyone. Welcome to TDK Ventures Energy Week Session 4. If you joined us for previous sessions, welcome back, and thank you for spending more time with us. Today, we are very excited to discuss a number of energy-related topics with some esteemed guests. My name is Andrew Maywah, and I am an investment director at TDK Ventures. I will be your host and moderator today and look forward to introducing you to the wonderful group of experts that we have gathered for today's discussion. Today, we will have a lively panel discussion around the topics of energy storage systems, e-mobility, and grid, spaces that are interrelated and increasingly relevant in today's electrified world. Now, I am delighted to introduce our group of amazing panelists from academia, industry, startups, and from the venture community. I am truly humbled by each of the panelists here, and I'm really looking forward to a stimulating discussion. First, I would like to welcome Julia Song, co-founder and chief technology officer at ESS Inc. ESS is a leading manufacturer of long-duration batteries for commercial and utility-scale energy storage applications, and they just went public. Congrats, Julia. Julia spearheaded the development of iron flow battery technology and turned it into a commercial energy storage system. Our second panelist is Professor Hong Li, professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Institute of Physics. Professor Hong Li is the co-founder of Beijing Weilian New Energy Technology Company Limited, Beijing Weilan 新能源科技有限公司, a solid-state battery company, and Haina Battery Company, Zhongke Haina, which developed the world's first megawatt-hour sodium-ion battery energy storage system. Professor Hong Li is a pioneer in China, commercializing leading-edge battery technologies. Next, we have Sarah Applebaum, partner at Pangea Ventures. Pangea invests in entrepreneurs that are developing hard tech and advanced materials innovations. Sarah brings a decade of VC and company building experience to the team. Pangea Ventures invests in energy sustainability companies and even invested in Julia's company, ESS. Our fourth panelist is Andy Lubershane, Senior Vice President of Research and Strategy at Energy Impact Partners. Andy leads research at the firm, generating insights to guide their investing strategy. Andy has done extensive research on energy storage and grid integration of renewables. Energy Impact Partners invested in Proterra, Form Energy, Volta Charging, and Li Cycle. Next up, we have Professor Zhu Li, the Battelle Energy Alliance Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering and Material Science and Engineering at MIT. Professor Zhu Li is a world-leading researcher on solid-state batteries, nuclear energy, energy storage, and energy conversion. Professor Li's group is developing novel nanostructured materials for energy storage and conversion in applications such as batteries and fuel cells. Our sixth panelist is Veronica Li, founding member at Primavera Venture Partners. Veronica has extensive experience in the energy and transportation sectors with investments in next-generation EV companies NIO and XPeng Motors, Xiaopeng汽车, in addition to autonomous driving technology company Zoox. And last but not least, I would like to welcome our seventh panelist, Rajesh Swaminathan, partner at Khosla Ventures. Rajesh brings over 2 decades of experience investing in deep tech and clean tech startups. At Khosla Ventures, Rajesh manages deep tech investments across hydrogen, solar, energy storage, industrial decarbonization, among other spaces. Khosla invested in QuantumScape, an innovator in solid-state batteries. A huge thank you to all our panelists for joining today, and I can't wait to get the discussion going. But first, let me review the agenda for today, as well as some background on the topics we will be exploring, as well as ways for you, the audience, to get involved in today's conversation. The general format for our session today is as follows. First, I'll provide a quick introduction to today's session, followed by 80 minutes of in-depth discussion, even with some audience engagement about today's topics, focused on 2 high-level starter questions, and finish with 30 minutes of audience Q&A. Please note that for the Q&A portion, as an audience member, we highly recommend that you either have your mobile phone ready or an extra tab open on your browser so that you can submit your responses within the digital polling tool that we will be using to gather feedback. Now, to briefly frame today's discussion about ESS, e-mobility, and grid, here are a few key points to keep in mind when exploring these spaces. The mobility industry is undergoing incredible economic, technological, and social transformation. Driven by increased awareness of climate change and cost reduction of EVs, the market for electric mobility, or e-mobility, has witnessed a 41% annual growth in past years. EV range anxiety remains one of the biggest barriers to widespread adoption. Consumers demand a vehicle that is fun to drive and one that offers a driving experience similar to an internal combustion engine, such as long range and short charging times. For consumers, not having access to fast EV charging is seen as a serious barrier to EV adoption. Automotive OEMs continue to champion increased infrastructure and charging stations in major cities and along major highways. This challenge demonstrates why quick charging capabilities are an important development. Additionally, grid storage uses of advanced batteries are also anticipated to grow. With greater duration requirements and less stringent density and weight constraints, non-lithium storage technologies may emerge as potentially cost-effective long-term solutions for stationary storage. And now, as a last step before kicking off today's energetic discussion, a final reminder for how this forum will go. We will be focusing our discussion of ESS, e-mobility, and grid around 2 guiding questions. The first discussion will be focused on what is the most impactful innovation in ESS, e-mobility, and grid that will be realized in the next 5 years. The second discussion will be focused on what is the most challenging innovation that will disrupt the market in the coming 10 years. Our hope is to have a spirited discussion with diverse opinions, maybe even contrarian views, to uncover what cutting-edge technologies, trends, and innovations the energy industry should be paying attention to. The way we will proceed is by gathering answers to these major questions from our panelists, and then those answers will then fuel an initial discussion. We will then shift gears and have an opportunity for you, the audience, to get involved. The first way to do this will be with your votes on the answers provided by our panel. Be sure to have a mobile phone or extra browser tab open to vote. Finally, we will open up the floor for questions in the comment section on the right-hand side of your screen. We look forward to selecting your questions and hearing what our panelists will have to say. Now, on to the main content for today. Let's dig into the first key question. Panelists, please see the link in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen and click through to submit your answers to what you think the most meaningful innovation to be realized in the next 5 years in the ESS, e-mobility, and grid spaces will be. Okay, we see answers coming in. Very interesting. Software, vehicle to grid. Iron flow battery. Okay, that's an interesting one. Oh, and comprehensive diversified charging infrastructure. Oh, seems very exciting. Can't wait to dig into that one. Oh, ML/AI-based approaches. This seems very interesting. I think we should have a very spirited discussion around this one. If you haven't already entered your answers, please quickly submit them. We have about 20 seconds remaining. Efficient material recovering and recycling. Okay, that's a really good one. About 10 seconds remaining. And there we have it. The poll is closed. So now we can begin our discussion. To kick it off, why don't we actually start with the AI/ML topic? who from our panelists would like to share their thoughts and expand on the AI ML topic that was mentioned as one of our answers?
Happy to jump in. So there is no voting. We just jump directly to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So I've been investing in batteries for the last about 13 years in some of the lithium metal companies, and Vinod's invested in QuantumScape. Historically, we have seen many of the companies really doing a brute force method, really smart people coming together to figure out what electrolyte chemistry, how do you optimize for everything, all of that stuff. So it's been a difficult journey. And there have been a whole bunch of companies in the past in CombiChem, combinatorial chemistry 1.0 days, companies like Wildcat, and many people who have tried it in the past, but it's not been very successful. But now I feel like it's time to leverage so much that has happened in machine learning, AI, and even in the next decade, maybe even quantum computing, to really figure out, in some ways, start from the scratch to see what is the ideal combination of material choices we have to be making, and what kind of performance parameters we should be shooting for, and do a battery materials, just be in a battery materials discovery mode in some form or fashion. We've seen some interesting companies come through that are trying to do exactly that. So I'm really looking forward to making the next set of investments in our battery landscape based on some of the ideas being tried out here.
Okay, wonderful.
I would like to add to that, just saying, in my lab, we're doing active learning of complex electrolytes with multiple solvents and high concentration salts to improve the cycle life and improve safety. And I think some of the difficulty in that area is we don't have a very good way of testing these formulations. So we can make them and we can, but it's difficult to tell, especially for the how they're going to really behave in a cell setting. So there's still a lot of manual labor involved. And I think a great innovation would be if we can automate cell making, or not even making a coin cell. That'd be great.
Absolutely, fully agree.
Very good. And
I'm curious to. Sorry, I'm curious to ask. This is such an interesting topic that I personally have not really thought about before. So maybe a follow-up question, which is, Rajesh, what do you see as the parallels to AI and ML approaches to kind of new battery material approaches or kind of science and chemistry? And how does it parallel to something like, say, AI drug discovery, where, it's maybe a few years ahead in a curve, and a lot of really great insights have come because we have so much data now that is, categorized and labeled and tagged kind of, uniformly across a number of databases in healthcare. So I'd be curious to know, do you see these similar approaches being applied because the data in, battery science and material science is becoming accessible at a larger scale?
Actually, it's not a question, it's a perfect answer. I would have said pharma as an example of where exactly AI and ML is happening today, because we have invested in some of those companies and see the rate of learning happening. In pharma, it wasn't that way before, but now that's accelerating in other verticals where people thought everything is to be done by brute force. So combination of top talent, like what Julie was talking about, in terms of people really working at the labs and testing it out, and a combination with AI and ML is the right way to do it. Completely agree.
I think one of the things A may be lacking, though, is I think one of the things as we learn when we scale up ESS is sometimes there is an optimization between going purely after performance from a lab into actually manufacturing something that's cost effective. So I think we've done some of that work early on, with some of the national labs, and I think it certainly shows us promisings of, you may get better performance or better durability, better cyclability, but what's lacking is there's no data behind how much manufacturing costs you have to put in place to support that little bit improvement on efficiency, and does that actually justify the work that you're trying to do?
Absolutely right, Julia. I think the infrastructure doesn't exist today from a hardware's high throughput screening perspective. And AI or ML is garbage in, garbage out in some ways, right? Unless you have the right data, right infrastructure to test all of this stuff, this won't fly. But the whole ecosystem needs to come together to make it more efficient.
Agreed.
And it's a long journey. That's why it's at least a 5-year away in terms of getting there.
And just to chime in here as well. Oh, sorry. The team that you need to sort of run your AI materials discovery platform and optimization is very different than the team skill set and resources that you need to sort of build, fund, operate, and execute on a battery materials company. And so how do you marry sort of the discovery engine with the execution go-to-market?
In fact, we have seen one very interesting company, very early stage. We haven't invested, but really bringing battery chemists from some of the universities that we know very well and attracting people who are AI ML experts from other verticals. So that combination of team is what is critical. And we're just starting to see some of these companies coming together with the right team.
Yeah, so this problem of getting high throughput data is why we start with electrolyte, because it actually takes a long time to make solid powders, and that's why with liquid handling robots, so that's how we can get rapidly data. That's where I think the next breakthrough may come in. I think for both the cathode development, for example, lithium or manganese-rich cathode, and other battery chemistry, the materials, because of the way solid-state synthesis takes very long time, that may come a bit later.
Actually, Julie, you have a good point that automated handling and automation of the robotics is also extremely critical. As a parallel, we saw the same thing happen in pharma. We invested in a company called OpenTron. Before the COVID, they've been kind of a rocket ship in terms of importance of automated handling for the pharma markets. So similar things are needed for battery as well, to your point.
Yeah. So we actually bought OpenTron robots, and powder handling is a completely different story. So that's much more challenging.
Sure. Okay, good to know.
Why don't we shift gears a little bit? One of the answers I saw that I think is very interesting is the answer around vehicle to grid. For our panelists, who would like to share their thoughts around vehicle to grid?
Yeah, so I can jump in, and I think the one big issue is our manufacturing capability and lithium resources may not be able to, have enough lithium and other minerals to support huge rollout of ESS. And I think lithium-ion batteries are now very economic, and we need the better battery management systems. And I think the vehicle can stabilize the grid, and I think we need just better software and more fluid user experience. I think there can be a hybridization of the electric fleet and the grid. I think that's a very cheap solution in the next 5 years.
Sarah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think Julie makes a really interesting point about sort of resource constraints and limitations, and thinking about aging infrastructure or aging grid, the current capacity, and what level of investment is needed, not only in the US, but around the globe to make that a reality. I'm much more bullish and optimistic in the near term on material recovery, both in manufacturing, but also recovery and recycling end of use from both vehicles, consumer electronics, and other implementations of lithium ion where the capabilities of the technology have degraded to a point where it's not suitable for 1,000+ cycles, but the material is still really valuable and can be recovered, upcycled, and put back into the supply chain.
I have maybe two comments there. The first is a little bit of a contrarian take, I would say, on vehicle to grid that I've developed over the past few years, which is that I think it may occur in a pretty limited extent in certain niche scenarios like school buses and things that are very low utilization vehicles and might be available at the right times of day to plug in with sufficiently big batteries. But overall, I don't see it happening at scale. And one of the reasons is if you just think about, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, when the vast majority of electric vehicles are going to be plugged in and charging, it's more or less either going to be at home, in which case there's going to be a role for some amount of managed charging, but typically overnight is not the time that grid operators need a lot of that excess capacity. And then it's going to be in the middle of the day if people are out fast charging. If you're fast charging, you're not willing to provide any of that capacity in your battery, to a grid operator. Obviously, you're not willing to pay. You're willing to pay extra to charge it as fast as possible, as opposed to accept money to delay charging by any amount. So I've become pretty skeptical of vehicle to grid occurring at any kind of meaningful scale for the grid anytime soon. On the materials point, I do think that's really important. And one of the reasons that I think, regardless of sort of recovery and recycling of lithium and other key EV battery metals, I think that we're going to increasingly see over the next 5-10 years a real divergence between any of the technology that's deployed on the grid for stationary storage and anything deployed in vehicles. I mean, there's not really a reason you need to use lithium, which is the lightest metal in grid in stationary storage applications. The only reason we're doing it today is because it's the only thing we're making at scale to really drive the cost down. So I really see a divergence happening pretty soon. You can already see that happening with lithium iron phosphate versus NMC batteries.
And just to chime in on that point, maybe I'll throw it to Julia to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the space when it comes to stationary storage displacing lithium as we go to longer cost duration, and how that sort of negates the need for that sort of 4 or 5 hour shorter term duration with those more expensive technologies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I was also going to say I agree with Andy in terms of the vehicle to grid. And in addition to everything that Andy already said, I just don't see a mass consumer would allow a grid operator to go manage their vehicles on a time to support the grid need, right? There's kind of contradicting with each other. The other thing we also see, we have actually like a pretty large gas stations, and they would come to us where the problem they are having is that they are trying to attract more EV into gas stations, where they install quite a bit of fast charging stations. But the problem they run into is that when they get a lot of cars coming to charge, they actually have huge swing on power requirements that trick them into a much higher cost structures on the grid, where they actually need a storage solution that's connected at the gas station to support a fast charging. So I think that also sets another challenge with, it's not simple as imagining everybody get a fast charging station and charging their cars, right? So based on what we see on the market, I mean, first of all, the grid scale, the long duration grid scale energy storage market is huge, and it's growing at a speed really faster than what I would say a lot of the analysts even anticipating. However, one of the issues with using lithium-ion type of technology for the grid storage is the fact that they are flammable. If you look at even California, last year in the West Coast, we got a lot of wildfire happening. California, Oregon, there's specific laws come out where they would prevent using lithium-ion batteries in a fire zone, right? So these are the places where I think the grid scale, they're really looking for something that's lower cost, that's non-flammable, that's safe to use. And I think I agree to what Andrew said at the very beginning. It opens up a huge market for non-lithium ion based chemistry that may not be as energy dense as power dense. However, it has other attributes that really contribute to the grid scale storage.
Yeah, if I may add to the vehicle to grid, I think if you look at the context of outside the US and perhaps Asia or India, there are not even too many options when you're riding an e-scooter or a bike to charge it at home or send it back to the grid. So there is a lot of proliferation of swappable batteries and so on and so forth. In that case, the grid is there's not even many options to take the energy back to the grid from your vehicle. So that's the context around something outside the US.
Well, I'd just like to add that from the battery design aspect, we have to, right now the vehicle batteries are probably not designed for supporting the grid. So I think Professor Jeff Dunn has done a lot of good work showing that you may not just always pursue energy density, but you could design the battery that it can be, have dual use for electric vehicles and for the grid. And I think cost is a huge issue. So I see, in the next 5 years, that lithium ion is really going to break the scale. So it's really going to have a big impact on the grid. And lastly, I want to say that I think I use a personal car, but I think in the future, car sharing and also this working remote would greatly remove the congestions. So I think when I drive my car to MIT, it's parked in a company parking lot, and that's when the sun starts to shine and you can use renewable. So I'm not saying this is the only solution, obviously, but I think this could have a good economy of scale in the near term, in the next 5 years.
Okay, I'm home here. So V2G has been tested in China for last 5 years, and according to the experience, so people expect still we need at least 5 years for commercialization because we need automatic driving, automatic parking, automatic charging, and also the large price difference between the electricity. So as mentioned by Julia and also G, I think it's too early for V2G. The idea is great, but the battery is not ready and other technology are not ready. That's my opinion. We have tested already, but not yet commercialized.
Julia,
just to circle back.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Rajesh, go ahead. I was going to say, just to circle back to the infrastructure piece that you brought up in sort of emerging markets, India and elsewhere. I mean, that's a huge problem. But going back to North America, like I live in Vancouver, which is, trying to be the greenest city in North America, if not globally, relatively soon. And I'm in a condo building, and my building of 40 units, we're a 35-year-old building, can only support 3 fast charging stations. So there are some limits here just based on the infrastructure that we have today.
I thought Julie made a really good point there, and just want to elaborate on that a bit, which is, if over the long term some form of V2G does emerge, I think it's going to be done through managed fleets, essentially. Like, this is not going to be something that happens a lot at the individual consumer level, but you can envision a scenario in which you've got a large fleet of electric vehicles that has a really dedicated, charging hub for them and has really predictable driving patterns, so exactly when you're going to be able to provide capacity to the grid. And in that scenario, I think actually that's the business model over the long term that could really make it work. Oh, go ahead.
I mean, I think in North America, sometimes it's not just to the grid; it's just to the house. In the Texas situation, those people who have So I can imagine, not necessarily to the grid, but just supporting the household.
It's actually exactly, we're thinking on the same wavelength. I really think the vehicle to home concept, while it's kind of it's quirky and doesn't actually add a huge amount of value 99.97% of the time when the grid is up and running, it's kind of cool, and I actually think is a feature that could drive adoption, right? Like that new Ford F-150 whose battery has enough juice to power your home for 3 to 4 days if there's an outage, and comes kind of standard with a vehicle to home ready charger installed. I mean, that's the kind of thing that can move some people from old school Ford F-150 to Ford F-150. My father-in-law included, by the way, so there you go.
One topic I'd like to get back to is efficient material recovery and recycling. Would anyone from the audience like to share a little bit more, elaborate further on some important parts about aspects for material recovery and recycling?
Yeah, so I can start. Right now, most of the recyclers are going after cobalt, and I think even the nickel is not fully recovered, and that's really deplorable. So the data is very murky, but right now I think the best statistics of lithium-ion battery recycling is like 10%, less than 20% for sure, and that's kind of really deplorable. And I think we need new ways of recycling economically, including lithium iron phosphate. In fact, we are working on direct recycling in this new startup, eIon, which we just started this week, actually. So I think that's a crucial ingredient to support, to have the resources to support ESS in the most cost-effective way.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just to sort of take it one step further, looking sort of beyond the 5 to 10 year time horizon, Andrew, that your questions pose, I fundamentally believe that, future generations, 150, 200 years from now or a little bit further out are going to be, absolutely appalled that, we spent 100 years mining resources out of the earth in a sort of non-sustainable, non-renewable fashion, just like they're going to be appalled that we continue to, eat animals and animal byproducts. And there's going to be a sea change in how we think about sort of materials and resources and energy through some of these technology advancements.
Yeah, I completely agree. From a recycling perspective, I think we are taking approaches to bring what has been already put into the market. But if you start with a clean slate, I would love to know, how would you design for recovery? Not just design for performance, design for cost, but if you were to do design for recovery, what would you do? And most of the approaches recycling today are the same kind of pyrometallurgy, hydrometallurgy kind of approaches. If there are ways to directly get the material back and put it in the batteries, would love to see what are some approaches there.
Do you have any idea in terms of recycling? What's the cost and the efficiency that the industry need to hit to make it viable?
So right now, there is actually about the same amount of cost and carbon emission as making new materials. And so very often it's a negative value statement because you also have secondary pollutions. And in regions like California, it's just very difficult to actually have anything going on in that space. So we really need AI and robotics for battery disassembly. We need better ways of processing, which save capital costs. So there's a lot to be done in that space.
Yeah, and we're not paying the true cost for a lot of these input materials, right? Like the externalities aren't being factored in, whether it's sort of the full carbon footprint, the long-term environmental issues, or the cost of labor, because a lot of these materials are mined in sort of conflict zones or other areas of the world that have very different standards of workplaces and living than we get to enjoy in North America. I don't think that's the conversation for today, but when we're talking about costs, we're not comparing true costs with each other.
Yeah, maybe to Julie's point, I think one of the largest costs of battery recycling today, to my understanding, is also just transportation costs purely, and that seems to be something that is going to continue to be a barrier in terms of thinking about ROI and sustainability, because when you look at how battery recycling maybe into the future is done on a mass scale, it will, we'll attempt to continue to localize it in North America, batteries made here, get recycled here, end of life is here. Asia is a completely different, a segment, which does their own entirely kind of different ecosystem. Europe seems to be the same. And so I feel like there is, interestingly, sort of both an attempt to kind of mitigate some of those costs, and as well as kind of an inability to kind of utilize more efficient things like supply chains and transportation and kind of the global ecosystem, which a lot of other industries I feel like have adopted. So that's something that I feel like will continue to be kind of a barrier there. To Sarah's point, I wanted to kind of think about that as well. Maybe it's a question for the group, but I remember kind of looking into if you recycle kind of all of the materials out there today, which are kind of in automobiles, kind of in use, you're still really only in the next kind of 5 to 7 years getting to, maybe 20% or less than that of the needs of materials for the production of increased, if we're about to hit our EV targets for the world, right? The recycling, even if you kind of think about the entire capacity, would not be able to kind of meet nearly enough of those needs. And so thinking about ways of mining more effectively, if that continues to be, which it does seem to be, a very relevant part of our future, I think is an important thing to think about. And maybe going back to the AI/ML piece at the beginning, I feel like that is an area where AI/ML is really going to maybe be able to be very helpful, is make mining less of a kind of blindly throwing darts, and something that's a little bit more environmentally friendly and efficient.
So I just give a few references. So in China, reuse, recovery, and recycling have become most hot topic for startup company. And there are several startup companies already demonstrate the technology, either recover the lithium iron phosphate or NCM, and also extract the lithium from the waste cells. So this become already a very hot business, not only the startup company, but also the lithium salt company like Tianqi Lithium, so already involved deeply. So I think this is a really important thing, because there are a lot of battery already being used in the EV in China. So, but how to do it efficiently and how to do it costly. So there are a lot of different paths. So I will skip the detailed discussion about the technology, but I would like to claim, so this is a really very important and hot topic now.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit. How about we talk a little bit about comprehensive charging infrastructure? Maybe not necessarily at home, but perhaps other locations along highways and major cities. What do our panelists think about comprehensive charging infrastructure?
I can jump in to start and say absolutely necessary. I'll start with maybe a controversial statement. I'm not sure, which is that probably the biggest thing that anyone in the EV charging world needs to kind of set aside as soon as possible is the concept of public level 2 charging. Any EV owners out there will know what I'm talking about. It's essentially close to useless to have these little level 2 stations out there that would take you hours and hours to charge a vehicle at a rest stop or a library, stuff like that. Although there's still lots of capital being deployed in those types of assets today. What's really needed is fast charging, and frankly, even what we call fast charging today, the 50 kilowatt DCFC, is nowhere near fast enough. I mean, if you've got a standard Nissan Leaf 40 kilowatt hour, 60 kilowatt hour battery, that's going to take you close to an hour to charge up, which is nowhere near the kind of experience of charging that consumers are used to, and I actually think is much more of a constraint on mass market electrification than even battery range or cost at this point. So we need much faster charging, and that costs a lot just in terms of infrastructure deployment. But on the other side, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more in a bit, but we also need batteries that can accept those types of fast charges without being degraded at the levels that conventional lithium-ion batteries would be.
Yeah, you need a grid-scale storage to support the fast charging. Right, even the grid itself is really not built for large amount of fast charging happening at the same time. Yeah,
it's interesting. So my firm is backed by a bunch of utilities, and we work really closely with those partners on these types of questions. And you start to look at putting a couple of 150, 350 kilowatt chargers out there pretty much anywhere, and you're immediately going to need some pretty significant grid upgrades to accommodate that new load. And in some cases, it is cheaper to add a behind the charger battery along with those chargers than to rebuild an entire substation to accommodate them.
Yeah, there's actually a big group of our customer coming to us is for that particular applications, right? They need a storage to be on the at each of their gas stations to support fast charging.
I'll try to be very provocative, and I think using personal car to do long trips is probably on the way out. So just think of like a car rental experience, right? So if you go somewhere different, new, why not just use a fleet, and you would have you would have this longer range issue automatically solved, and you don't even need to worry about charging. So the car will be there ready for you. And I think even the idea of driving, I think, may be on the way out, in the next 5 years.
I think you're being optimistic. I think it'd be very hard to convince the mass majority of the public, right, to give up that option of driving on their personal cars for trips. It's almost a change of an American way of thinking, right? Is this?
I mean, yeah. So I agree. So there will be a big segment where you still keep your personal vehicles, but for those 200, 300-mile trips, I kind of doubt you need your personal car for that. You can have a rental car basically in a fleet setting. Yeah, why have that anxiety, right? So you can just have the whole trip planned out in several cars.
Okay, any final thoughts on that? That is actually perhaps somewhat controversial, but any of the panelists want to comment further?
I'm actually curious to hear folks' views on, China has been so pro battery swapping infrastructure over the past, 4 or 5 years. And, that's, if you look at NEO as an example, they're saying their latest numbers say the 50% of the buyers of their vehicles are choosing the battery swapping option as opposed to buying a vehicle with their own battery in it. So, there's clearly a huge demand from the consumer side for this type of service. Obviously, the CapEx is huge. And therefore, that's why, policy is needed, government funding is needed. But I'm curious about what folks think about that as a solution here in the US.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I've been looking at it recently as well. I'm curious if it's a function of how dense the population is and what's the difficulty of charging it in a place where you live or where you work and so on. In all those cases, I think a battery swapping makes a little bit more sense compared to having a charging network.
I think now, so the fast charging station is already under construction, like 120 kilowatt, 350 kilowatt, 430 kilowatt, but connected with energy storage box in the city. So this will not give a break for the grid. So it's already under construction by some companies, including State Grid and also several large car companies. Each of them want to have the fast charging station, but the central government require all the company open the station, and which can be used for all kinds of EV car.
I'm also curious if it's in some ways a function of whether the vehicle you're talking about is a car or an e-scooter or a bike kind of stuff, because if it's some of the smaller ones, the swapping one makes much easier.
Yeah, for the e-bike, also the public charging station on the street, especially in the big city for the electric bike, because there are a lot of fire accidents in China when you're charging in the house, in the room. So this is there are a lot of serious lessons actually. So right now in the big cities already there are a charging station for e-bike especially.
All right, wonderful. This has just been a very stimulating conversation. I'd like to shift gears now to question 2. And having just taken a really good deep dive into these near-term innovations and their implications, let's now shift our focus to the longer-term implications. Panelists, please see the link in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen to submit your answer to what you think the most challenging but disruptive innovation will be for this market in the next 10 years. All right, answers coming in. Batteries capable of truly fast charging, meaning less than 10 minutes to a full charge. Ooh, very interesting. Autonomous vehicles. All right, that's certainly a topic that has been trending. High energy density mobile fuel. Okay, I think this is something that we could spend a good amount of time on digging into. Direct recycling of materials. Okay, recycling is a hot topic. All right, we have about 10 seconds left. Please quickly get your remaining answers in. Solar wind. Okay, very interesting topic. All right, the poll is closed. And so now we get a chance to jump right into discussion. And how about we get started with solar wind? What do our panelists think about that for longer term innovations that could be disruptive?
Sure, happy to jump in. So it's really, so first of all, I don't want to take the blame for talking about hydrogen in a battery conference. I'm really talking about hydrogen as a vehicle for taking the electricity from solar and wind, and really providing the resiliency and longer duration storage in a lot of use cases. For a few reasons. The transmission line costs, the dollar per megawatt mile, if the hydrogen you can produce it cheap enough, is much lower than having to build new electric grid. And if you were wondering why we are talking about hydrogen a battery material conference, a hydrogen electrolyzer is pretty much an electrochemical system. It's pretty much like a flow battery in many ways. So the audience here can go and certainly add all their experience to make it happen. But essentially, and this is a view for us over the last few months, having invested in a hydrogen company. We invested in a company called Verdagy. They are actually knocking it out of the park in terms of the overall cost, because they have a much larger alkaline system with an anion exchange membrane that can do 10x the current density. So they have figured out a way to reduce the cost significantly. So if you really have low cost wind and solar, and you can put a very low cost hydrogen on top of it, then you suddenly build a system that you can transport over long distance at a much cheaper cost compared to electricity. A lot to be done in terms of making that infrastructure happen. That's why it's a 10-year vision, but there are certainly reasons why this could be successful.
I think also the cost of the solar and wind is already dropped below 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So this is a really disrupting technology combined with low cost energy storage battery or energy storage technology. So combination of them are very revolutionary. I think this will also satisfy to decrease the carbon dioxide emission.
I agree, which is, I guess, part of my reason would be, if you have a low-cost energy storage coupled with a low-cost solar and wind, why would you need to add hydrogen in the middle of it, right? Like, what's the cost, and what's the cost you have to justify to go through a separate process and the added cost to that? That's where I find it challenging to try to push hydrogen storage onto the grid.
Yeah, so if you don't have a cheap enough hydrogen, then it doesn't make sense. But if you can get to the $1 per kilogram kind of a hydrogen system, then you can take that direct, just like you're adding a grid storage system to a solar or wind, you could add hydrogen to it. This is particularly valuable if you're trying to build out the electric grid, because you can site these systems in places where there is no electric grid, and building a hydrogen transmission pipeline is significantly more cheaper on a $1 per megawatt mile perspective versus building a completely new electric grid.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I think there are, for example, electric drones. So for flying vehicles, there's much higher requirement on the energy density, and hydrogen certainly have a leg up in the flying vehicle space.
The other advantage of hydrogen as a storage media for solar and wind energy that we're seeing is that provides a pathway to build capacity that's needed today in the power system, specifically gas turbine capacity or combined cycle gas turbine capacity, that can be transitioned to clean capacity over time, right? So because there's from all of the major gas turbine OEMs at this point, a pathway to blending up to say 30%, maybe even 50% hydrogen by volume today, and retrofitting, so long as you plan a new facility to be retrofittable, retrofitting to up to probably 100% hydrogen down the road you get the capacity and energy you need today out of that gas plant, and then you can there's a real option there to transition to clean hydrogen in various colors of hydrogen, right? There's other ways aside from electrolysis over time, which is really nice from a system planning standpoint. And then I would just I don't think it can be emphasized enough, Rajesh, your point about hydrogen being probably more valuable as a transmission media for energy than a storage media for these really remote wind and solar resources, which are going to be the cheapest wind and solar resources.
Right.
Yeah, but I think an alternative way, I guess maybe one of my questions, so if you go down, I guess if you do solar and wind, and then, electrolysis get hydrogen, and then you need to store the hydrogen. So if you take out the efficiency losses of every step, right, by the time you get your final product and ship it to the gas turbine and I'm trying to, I guess, I don't know, what's the efficiency that you're looking at by the time you actually get to use that hydrogen?
Yeah, the efficiency would certainly be lower than lithium ion, but a lot of the grid storage solutions also don't have a 90-95% efficiency that a lithium ion has. So that's one thing. In terms of storage, there are certainly much lower cost storage options available once you make the hydrogen. People are looking at storing it in caverns, storing it in containers. Those are really cheap options to actually store the stuff. It's mainly the advantage that you get from transmission, like we just talked about, much lower cost than building the transmission lines, which we'll have to do as the grid expands. And just to clarify, we are big believers in grid storage. We have done grid investments. Like I've done flow battery in the past. We are an investor in Natron. We are looking at a lot of long duration storage.
No, absolutely. I just think that, alternatively to a transporting hydrogen, I just think it makes a lot more sense to really build microgrids at the remote areas with cheap solar and wind and with cheap energy storage. It will be a better option, I think, if you just look at the overall economic sense.
What I would say, Julia, is I think hydrogen will only make sense as a storage media and as just a media for carrying energy in general at very large scale. So you're going to see, I think the way it's going to go is you're going to have very large wind and solar farms way out in the middle of nowhere, the best resource you can imagine. Forget about electric transmission. You don't need a site and permit that stuff. It's a nightmare. Instead, build the pipeline. And it's really used as a form of very long duration seasonal storage. And remember, a lot of that hydrogen is not going to go back into the power system through conversion back to electricity. Much of it can be applied in some really tough to decarbonize end uses, industry, et cetera. So I think that's kind of where I've arrived at the vision for hydrogen, which does still leave a really big role for storage on the grid as well.
Well, having said that, there are a lot of material difficulties like hydrogen embrittlement, the valves, which hydrogen is notoriously difficult to seal in. So it is tough to develop the pipeline that you mentioned. And actually, we are looking at natural gas pipeline, how to retrofit those with the hydrogen permeation barriers for long distance transmission.
Well, one advantage I do want to add is just like lithium ion being used in EVs extensively is now making it easier for using in grid as well. Hydrogen, we are not using it for grid storage first. It is being, every day you see multi-billion-dollar projects being announced for supplying hydrogen to existing markets, for steel industry and many other industries. So together we'll all figure out all of that stuff. So as you think about a 10-year vision, hydrogen would be ripe for being part of the grid storage market as well. So somebody else is going to solve the problems, solve the many next steps that need to happen before we incorporate that in the grid storage.
The one thing I would say on more of a contrarian perspective on hydrogen is if you don't have to convert cheap electricity generation to hydrogen, you shouldn't, right? Because there is a significant efficiency loss. And I think increasingly some of these really hard to decarbonize sectors, and historically sectors that are viewed as almost impossible to electrify, say steel manufacturing, high temperature industrial heat, heavy duty vehicles, you look at the trajectory for battery technology, which we'll talk more about, for vehicles. You look at the trajectory of electrification options for even high temperature industrial heat, and actually, which lends itself very nicely to storage via thermal storage. I actually think that there's a lot of areas that are kind of seen as like that natural domain for hydrogen as a decarbonization mechanism that electricity is kind of nipping at its heels, right? And it's going to be an interesting contest over this decade for sure.
Fully agree.
And what do our panelists think about autonomous vehicles? What are your thoughts on how autonomous vehicles can change the landscape in the long term?
Well, it's going to change everything because we're going to need fewer cars, which is a good thing. I don't think we need one car per adult. So it's going to really reduce the environmental burden on the whole ecosystem. So that's a great thing. I mean, even though I really love my Honda very much, but I don't think yeah.
Well, and I think on the autonomous point too, it also changes sort of how we think about vehicles as a resource. I don't remember the exact statistic, but it's like the average American, their vehicle sits parked either at their home or at their place of work, like 90 to 96% of the time. And so how do we increase vehicle utilization? And whether it's around sort of charging and vehicle to grid, which we talked about earlier, but also through the sharing economy so that we do need fewer resources.
Yeah, I threw out autonomous vehicles out there to take Andrew's challenge to be audacious to the extreme. So I do think they, maybe when we looked at this, 4 or 5 years ago, we thought autonomous vehicles would already be rolling out on the roads, at a mass urban scale today. So now the timeline's pushed back a bit. I think 10 years is conservative, but hopefully we'll get there within the 10. I maybe a bit of a personal view, but I've spent kind of most of the last 8 to 10 years in Asia, where I lived in places most people really don't own cars, right? And coming back to the U.S. last year, I'm continually shocked by the sense of kind of driving 75 on a freeway and feeling that every single person who's driving on the road is just, I can't believe we're all allowed to drive and wield such a rapid, powerful weapon. So it's a bit of a personal, view, but I'm still constantly shocked every day that we are able or allowed to do so.
And Veronica, thanks for that. And to follow up on that point, how do we see autonomous vehicles rolling out in the various geographies, Europe versus North America versus Asia? And how does legal and regulatory impact that?
I'm happy to talk about China as a region. When you look broadly, roughly 20% of Chinese households have own cars, and when you think about kind of the environmental impact in a negative way, if we were to get to the American 90% of household own cars, that is definitely something that China maybe as a country is trying not to do. And so a lot of this is really coming from how do we ensure sustainability and at the same time access to transportation and mobility. So fundamentally that is where it's coming from. I think I've honestly been surprised. I thought US would be kind of maybe in the lead or faster than China in terms of adoption of autonomous vehicle, from a policy perspective. But actually in China, if you look at Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, as well as tier 2 cities, there's a number of startup companies that have permits to drive, test autonomous vehicles, not only in a purely testing environment, but also on roads, picking up real passengers and receiving payment in a commercial transaction, just as you would, an Uber or a Lyft. And so that's really happening pretty much all over China in kind of geofenced specific urban areas all over these major cities. So you can very much tell that is becoming increasingly a norm, and in fact accelerating as a trend. And there's now I think 3 driverless startups that have gotten driverless permits as well to operate same way, mobile app, pick up passengers in a driverless way and take them around in these geofenced areas, which are large. I mean, they're they're at least 100 kilometers kind of across, and so there's I think a lot of demand and interest and support for this at a policy level, at least in China.
Yeah, I think there's no turning back. So it's going to take less than 10 years. So I think once the experience.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Julie.
No, it's fine. So I'm saying once the experience
curious, what's preventing it from? Like, why is it in your mind, Veronica? Why is it delayed from a why you're looking at 10 years and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, again, 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said we should have them on the roads now. And so I think 2 things. I think one is the whole industry has been surprised by the number of edge cases that people have not yet solved for. And it could be anything from just snow on the road to kind of the way the sun hits a freeway and it's just not clear. I mean, there's just a number of cases, and it seems that simulations for edge cases have not been able to solve a lot of these issues, and so that is certainly an area of concern. I think the other part of the U.S. More broadly is I do think that the U.S. is a much more litigious overall environment, and there's a lot of kind of fundamental hurdles right now as to responsibility. In case of accidents, who's kind of at fault. There's a whole ecosystem of insurance and law and kind of that has to kind of come up to support this new mode of transportation, which I think places like China I think are much less where there's much less, I guess, red tape. Mm.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. What do we think about new chemistries or new fuels? Solid lithium-ion batteries, sodium-ion. What are your thoughts around those as important technologies for EV and smart grid?
I can maybe start off. So I'm not sure specifically what the exact chemistry or technology is going to be, but as Veronica very aptly pointed out, in the first part of the discussion, we just fundamentally don't have enough resources, whether it's, cobalt, nickel, lithium, to meet the EV demand and our targets over the next 5 to 10 years. And so we need an alternative solution. Europe is investing heavily in hydrogen infrastructure and fuel cells, so that could be part of it. And Rajesh, going back to talking about hydrogen, but maybe there are also other chemistries and things to think about on that sort of 10 plus year time horizon that could supplement lithium ion and hydrogen fuel cells.
Yeah, I think there will be interest in looking at new materials. We are dealing with the materials that we have known for a long time, and suddenly the EV revolution has taken off. So people are trying to use whatever we have known for a long time and try to get into the market. But as you want to address a lot of parameters, whether it is fast charging or longer cycle life or longer range, if you put all of those parameters, there will always be an interest to figure out what are the new materials we should be looking at. But at some point, I think the industry will figure out what's the ideal combination, and that will become stable. I mean, this happened in solar, right? In the first clean tech 1.0 wave, there were really 200 solar companies. There were crystalline silicon, there was thin film silicon, there was CATL, SIGs, a whole bunch of things. And then the market narrowed it down to crystalline silicon. So I think that kind of a process you need to go through to evaluate a lot of options, a lot of solutions. Maybe there are 2 or 3 winning approaches, but unless you go through the filter, you won't have the right materials discovery and the right amount of stuff to be tested. So I think there'll always be good academic interests, some of the larger corporations will be evaluating many of these things. And the grid storage would have to come up with a lot more options than the EV market, because grid storage is a lot of business cases. There are 2-hour duration, 6-hour duration, 10-hour duration, day-to-day, seasonal, all of that stuff. So different chemistry might win in a different market compared to EV, where the requirements are fairly understood in terms of what you're looking for.
Well, and maybe to be a bit contrarian here, I think actually, grid scale duration storage, when we have widespread penetration of longer duration storage in that 8 to 12-hour range, I think we're going to see the need for that shorter duration sort of evaporate as the longer duration is able to sort of be flexible and fill that gap.
Yeah, it's a fair point. If it's able to do the resiliency, the shorter duration, C rates that you're looking for, all of that stuff, then that might as well happen. But it might also be a question of cost. Are you over-speccing the system for certain configurations you're looking for? But I don't disagree with you. It's a fair point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I can remark on the... Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. I was going to say, I would agree with Sarah that a battery, honestly, a battery is a battery, right? So if the customer has installed and if the grid needs long duration and there are long duration energy storage on the grid, they can absolutely do the shorter duration application cases for the grid. I think these days we're just seeing the transition where, I would say even when we first started the business, most people, when we try to sell the idea of a long duration, most people would say, why would I need long duration? I need maybe less than 1 hour. That's all I need. But that landscape has just changed dramatically, and it's going to continue to move towards longer duration time. So I think, the shorter duration applications can totally be, I think a long duration battery can totally do the job of the shorter duration.
I'm not sure if it can happen today. A lot of the long duration stuff is very good for slightly longer duration, but I'm not sure they can do ancillary services like a flywheel or a lithium-ion battery or a Natron can do today. But and that's one of my concerns in terms of, sometimes when you add a battery, you may have to have a system for a much shorter duration, really few microseconds, milliseconds kind of stuff, and then a medium duration, and then a longer duration. You really need 3 batteries. But if you can get all 3 in one, why wouldn't I take it at the right cost?
Yes, I think you can.
Okay.
Yeah, so on the battery chemistry side, I would say, in 10 years, on the cathode side, we're going to have maybe hybridization of the intercalation, transition metal-based redox to more and more oxygen anion. So we have this hybrid anion-cation redox for cathode materials, which is, people have looked at, for example, lithium air, which is or lithium sulfur, which is a pure oxygen or sulfur-based redox. And I think some kind of composite between these two for the cathode. For the anode, I think silicon, more and more silicon or hard carbon with graphite to improve the fast charging. And then for energy density, of course, solid electrolyte and lithium metal or lithium alloy-based batteries, with more than 400 watt-hour per kilogram kind of a gravimetric energy densities. In sort of 10 years time frame, you can see that on the commercial market.
Very powerful. And one of the things that came up in the discussion is this idea of much longer term duration energy storage technology. What do our panelists think about, say, greater than 10 hours energy storage technology?
So hydrogen, of course, is in one, but I think new chemistries like ammonia or methanol, it deserves very careful look at, which are subsidiary to the hydrogen. They're much easier to liquefy, so they are worse.
Building a little bit on the conversation that Julia and Rajesh were having in the last piece, I really think there's probably room for kind of 3 major tranches of storage on the grid. The first would be very short duration stuff, maybe up to 4 hours like we're seeing today. And lithium ion or whatever the future variant on lithium ion that emerges, that's kind of got it covered. I don't really see much competing with lithium up to 4, maybe even 6, 8 hours. The next tranche, and one of the reasons for that, by the way, is if you're doing daily peak shaving, which is what that kind of tranche of storage is designed to do, you want high cycle life and you want high efficiency, and lithium has both of those things. If you're going to be doing the next tranche of storage, which is say 10, 12, maybe even up to 16, 20 hours, which, is probably still done on a daily basis, but is really shaving or really balancing load and renewables over the course of at least an intraday period, maybe even, 1 to 2 days at a time. You still care about cycle life. Obviously, you're doing a cycle roughly every day. You can probably sacrifice efficiency a little bit more at that point because you're assuming that that there's a higher penetration of renewables, and some of what you're charging on is, quote, excess, right? And then the last tranche, actually, we've invested in a company in this space, is what I would think of as multi-day or seasonal storage. Hydrogen fits in that tranche, right? And there are electrochemical approaches, like Form Energy is a company in our portfolio, where you can get to 100+ hours of storage in a battery, which enables you to count on that battery as essentially a real firm seasonal peaking capacity resource and fully supplants the need for any fossil combustion. And that's the kind of battery you don't want to run all the time because it's generally going to be less efficient. You're going to be sacrificing a little bit of cycle life. And so I could actually see a hypothetical future grid where you have like 3 different types of batteries working in sort of parallel with each other. Not an easy optimization problem there for the operators, but someone will figure it out.
And cost, if you want all 3.
Right. And yeah, you got to figure out the right mix.
Fantastic. Thank you to the panelists for such a spirited exchange so far. And now we get to hear some feedback on this discussion from our audience. We will first gather some feedback on the answers to both of the discussion questions. So if you are in the audience, now is the time to get your mobile phone out and scan the QR code or open up your browser and click on that link, because you'll be able to vote on the answer to each discussion question that you thought was most exciting or interesting. And so you should find the link in the chat and on the screen and enter which industry you're from. Okay, we're seeing answers coming in, a good amount from academia, investors, and other. And we're seeing a few more coming in from academia. Oh, startup. Very good. We have some folks out there from the startup world. Definitely want to hear from them. A little bit more from the investing world. It's looking to be very similar investors and industry numbers. Oh, actually, industry is pulling ahead. We have about 30 seconds left. So audience, please continue to enter your answers through the QR code or the link. We see that industry is now at, roughly 33%, still beating investor and startup. Have about 15 seconds left. If you have some final answers, please enter them fairly quickly. About 5. And the poll is closed. Well, thank you, audience, for entering the industries you're from. But let's jump into the questions. For the first question, for the audience, what do you think is the most interesting answer that was provided by the panelists today? Please scan the QR code or click on the link in the chat to enter your answers. Okay, we're seeing investors jump ahead with some answers. Startups as well, now getting into the mix. All right, seems fairly even up to this point. No clear leader. Okay, I think we're seeing one or two. Actually, one space is pulling ahead fairly quickly. About 30 seconds left. Wow, we're getting good answers in from our folks in academia as well as investing world. Have about 10 seconds left. So if you have any final votes to enter, please enter them quickly. And our polling is closed. And so why don't we, it looks like, actually, if we take a second, why don't we first look at two of the spaces that did not receive answers. Can we increase the font a little bit? The fonts are a little small. My apologies. The fonts are a little bit small, so
I think, Andrew, one is vehicle to grid, the other is ion flow battery.
Okay, so why don't we think about for anyone from the panel to share, perhaps why vehicle to grid may not have gotten so many responses.
Can we vote on them now?
No. We'll,
I'm kidding. It's okay.
Actually, before we do that, before we discuss, why don't we ask the audience to provide their answers for question 2? Why don't we do that first? So folks from the audience, please enter, use the QR code to enter your answers for what you think is the most interesting answer for question 2. Okay, so academia and industry jump out early. All right, we're seeing one answer coming in at 33%. We have about 30 seconds left, so if you could fairly quickly enter your answers. Okay, very good. We have some actually some diversity amongst our audience thoughts here. So there's a lot of good material here for us to discuss. About 10 seconds left. If you have, if you're still waiting to enter your answer, please do so fairly soon. All right, the voting is closed, and we have our answers. But to kick off our discussion, why don't we go back to the audience answers, the audience voting for question 1. And maybe if we could remove the QR code, that could increase the font a little bit. Yeah, we'll take it down for a second. And it looks like we've got some very interesting audience perspectives on what we discussed. I really want to hear our panelists' thoughts on that. I think there's a lot that could be said around our audience responses to some of these answers. So we'll wait for that poll to come up on the screen. Should just take a few seconds. Oh, here we go. Okay, so it looks like one of the answers, yeah, it looks like one of the answers really around recovering recycling really took the lion's share of the interest from our audience. And I'd like to ask the panelists, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on our audience's interest in recovery and recycling?
Well, I think it's our duty to do that, because my view is that we're dealing with pollution, which is a vector of pollutants. So CO2 is one of the biggest one, but there's microplastics, there's heavy metal, there is persistent organics, there's particulates. So this problem of green waste is just morally unacceptable. That to have something, electronic waste is right now also a very bad problem. It's recycling rate around 20%, and I think both solar, wind, and battery have this similar issue, which is we really have a moral obligation to form a circular material economy with this renewable energy systems. So we just have to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think a year or two ago, I don't think people would have marked recycling as the main one, because we were all thinking about whether EV would even take off. Now that we are all buying Teslas and Hondas and everything else, I think all of us are genuinely concerned about recycling, and therefore the last 6 to 12 months, I think it's a hot topic. It's an important one. It makes you feel more responsible about being sustainability and all of that stuff. So I think it makes sense.
Yeah, and the other thing that hasn't even come up yet really in the discussion this evening is around supply chain, geopolitical challenges. How do we get material from A to B? And I think a lot of this is also being driven by, lack of availability, whether it's, computer chips for cars, cobalt, nickel for batteries, composite parts, whatever that component is. How do we think about closing the loop on our supply chain so we have more domestic supply of materials, domestic manufacturing, so that we're more insulated and resilient?
No, that's absolutely true. But I think one way to solve the supply chain issue is really start developing or putting the effort to develop technology using earth-abundant materials, right? There are two ways to do it. You can certainly solve it by putting the efficiencies and adding the recyclabilities of a material that's really hard to mine and hard to recycle. Or alternatively is to look at the same problem from a different angle, is how can we really invent our way using earth-abundant materials?
Yeah, building on that, I know I've said this before, but I guess I'd re-emphasize that when it comes to storage for the grid, I'm really confident we are going to move in directions like Julia's company, ESS, and others that don't use lithium and other rare metals from problematic supply chains like cobalt and to some degree nickel that are harder to come by, harder to expand mining capacity, etc. Right? So one great reason to expect a divergence in storage tech for the grid and for vehicles. I guess on the recycling piece, I'm really optimistic. Given some research we've done, we actually made an investment in this space, and really believe that the technology is either there or very close to being able to get very high recovery of most of the the key metals in lithium-ion batteries now and in the future, with really low emissions. I do agree with, I think Veronica said earlier, what we have is a collections problem, and sort of a pre-end of life supply chain that needs to get built out for these batteries, both on the consumer electronic side and the EV side. That's just not there yet because it hasn't had to be there yet. And there's some interesting opportunities probably, and there are certainly companies focused on the problem of, okay, let's say an EV battery gets to end of first life. Someone is done with the vehicle. It doesn't have enough capacity to be sold at a high enough price in a second life, or for a used vehicle sale, right? Is it better to recycle that battery? Is it better to repurpose it in a second life application for grid storage or behind the meter storage? I mean, I think there's business models to be built on that kind of classification and supply chain for end of life batteries.
Andy, very good points around supply chain and recycling and second life. I think those are very important points that we need to really look into further. Now, I would like to transition to our audience responses to question 2. Can we please see the audience voting results for question 2 on the screen? Thank you. So it looks like actually overwhelming responses around direct recycling. But instead of going back to that, I see that we have about 19% around autonomous vehicles. What are our panel's thoughts on how to interpret this audience voting for autonomous vehicles? Does this mean something?
Yeah, it means a lot. I mean, it means saving time of driving. Improve each person's time utilization. In my case, by 90 minutes per day round trip, and it means fewer cars. It means a better fleet management. So I think it's really revolutionary. And it's going to happen. It's not. There's no turning back. So once the AI has been trained, in Chinese cities and in U.S. cities, and I think once people see that, I would say in 3 years, this is really going to scale up.
Maybe one other comment on autonomous vehicles is I would love to see it kind of roll out in trucking first, honestly. You guys probably see the stats too out there. I mean, there's a huge shortage of truckers, maybe like 80,000 jobs this year. That's, exacerbating the supply chain issues that we all already have. And the sense is that, those jobs are maybe not coming back. And, those jobs are ones that people, find to be difficult and hard and no longer want. And so, as our, economy continues to need those capacities, we're really just, I think autonomy is really the only solution for that.
Well, and trucking is also a really interesting use case because it doesn't require sort of a broad change in consumer preferences. When is the average person or the average American going to be comfortable getting into an Uber without a real person behind the wheel? I think it's probably further than 3 years out. Our audience here might be, early adopters and ahead of the curve, but I think it's going to take a long time.
Okay, very good. I really liked this stirring discussion. And why don't we take the last roughly half hour or so to open up the floor to questions from our audience. I think if you're joining us in the audience, please feel free to post your questions in the chat section for our panelists to respond. Okay, let's see. Okay, first question. What do you think is the best application for flow batteries? Who would like to take that one?
I'll take that one.
Go for it, Julia.
I think because that question is asked a lot, right? So flow batteries, I personally believe, obviously that's why we're doing this, is really a perfect solution for grid scale energy storage, and especially when you pair a flow battery with a much more abundant and inexpensive materials. It's really just set up a perfect stage for grid scale storage because, number one, it does not have the requirement on energy density, power density as what the EVs or consumer electronics requires. Number two, it has a lot higher requirement in terms of safety and reliability and much less space constraints. So that would be my answer for that one.
Very good. And our next question, what are the demands on the batteries that back up fast charging? How does it compare versus current grid level and vehicle demands? Does it require more cycles, more power? Who'd like to take that one?
So obviously you need batteries like what Professor Hong Li mentioned, the battery box that support fast discharging. But fast discharging is actually much easier to do than fast charging. So you can actually use cheap batteries, and they can be buried, 2 meters in the ground. And so there's really you can find the cheap batteries and to do that. So I think that's really a very good solution instead of pulling it, from the live grid.
Yeah, I mean, batteries, you always have to give up on something when you want to get something else. So if you're going for a high C rates, then high charging or discharging, then it means you're going to require a lot more cycle life, as an example. But I'm sure there are other parameters we can talk about, because instead of charging for half an hour, if you're going to charge for 5 minutes, then you're going to have a lot more churn of vehicles coming through, and that's where the cycle life becomes critical.
Yeah, and as Julie mentioned, it's much easier to discharge a battery quickly than it is to charge a battery quickly. So there's two sides to the equation. It's the behind the meter or behind the grid storage for fast charging, but then what's the right technology at scale? Is it lithium? Is it something else for rapid fast charging? And how do we get from from an hour fast charge to like sub 10 minutes?
I think a combination of hard carbon with graphite is one solution, but also there are successors to the lithium titanate, so niobium based and tungsten based anode chemistries. Those look really promising.
One of the interesting things I think about the behind the charger battery use case is that it's actually quite uncertain exactly what the parameters that we're going to need for those types of systems will be. And I think pretty variable from site to site. You have to make a lot of assumptions today about charging patterns, right? Let's say you have a bank of eventually 3 150 kilowatt chargers at a, highway rest stop. I mean, are we going to see enough, is the charging pattern going to look like a lot of people trying to charge during certain peak hours, in which case you actually need a longer duration storage system to back that up effectively because you're going to be charging in rapid succession? Or are we going to see infrequent partial charges, in which case really high power, low duration is probably going to be effective? I think it's interesting. And I think we're going to see different approaches in different places.
On to the next question. What are the business models that you see are the winning ones for vehicle to grid?
Yeah, I think in America, coupling to the solar panel on the roof. So instead of, to the grid, I think to the house or to your neighbors, I think that's probably where we can start. Start small instead of, supporting the whole grid. So in remote areas, for example, in rural areas, I think this could be a very attractive option. I mean, I live in New England, so we have these ice storms where the grid very often is down. So, I bought a diesel generator 7 years ago, and I think with the new the Ford, this is not going to happen. I'm not going to buy a new diesel generator anymore.
On to the next question. Regarding battery swapping, is there a drive towards commonality to enable cross-swapping across different vehicles?
I don't know the answer to this question, but wouldn't it be great? I mean, it's, we look at sort of mobile phones and consumer electronics, and it's Apple versus everyone else with USB-C and their proprietary cable systems. If we're looking to reduce e-waste and simplify the ecosystem, having a universally adopted standard just makes sense. And that's going back to, I can't remember who made the comment, but design for functionality, recyclability, and end-of-life use cases.
I mean, sadly, we still have 3 different fast charging standards, right? So we need to work on that even just to get started.
No, I think that's the right end goal, Sarah. It's just that, companies are trying to build some business models around having battery swapping stations and trying to show that as a unique value proposition. So everybody's on their own at this point, but hopefully this will all converge at some point. But today I don't see a common kind of interoperability, same battery swaps between different systems. At some point that should happen. That'll be so much more convenient.
Okay, on to the next question. What can we learn from China on the social adaptations of EV drivers?
Do you want me to take that?
Please.
I'm just kidding. I don't know.
I'm not sure I understand
Veronica.
the question.
Sorry?
Yeah, I'm not sure I really understand the question. What do they mean by social adaptations?
Well, I don't want to read too much into the question, but I think in terms of you, Veronica, earlier you were describing the driving behaviors that you were seeing in China versus North America versus Europe. How do we see the various driving behaviors in the China market with respect to EV adoption, and I guess how that EV market is growing versus other markets?
Yeah, I guess maybe more importantly, it's the consumer habit, not of driving, but the consumer habit of purchase, and how do you kind of fuel kind of EV purchases, right, as a consumer choice over ICE. And so that really has played out in a number of very obvious ways in China, really kind of in a top-down way. So one, very simply, it's very hard to get a license plate in China for a car, and so by enabling, by encouraging essentially kind of a proliferation of and allowing kind of EV license plates to proliferate, it's very simply, you cannot get any other car. So it's that's one way to do it. The other kind of more of a carrot way to do it is there's very obviously just subsidies, right? If you buy an EV that's under 300,000 RMB, there's a subsidy for a consumer, and so there's just a lot of ways to kind of encourage consumer behavior towards choosing electric vehicles. That's again much more policy oriented, I think, than anything else, and maybe that's kind of what it takes, to get a little bit faster adoption.
Okay, very good, thank you. On to our next question. In February of 2021, the state of Texas suffered a major power crisis, which came about as a result of 3 severe winter storms. Are we going to see more of these types of grid disruptions? And if so, what can be done about this?
I mean, the short answer, Andrew, is yes. For 2 reasons. One, you look at any of the climate models, any of the climate science, we're going to see an increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. And number 2, we have an infrastructure investment problem.
Yeah, it's a highly siloed markets. Like, markets don't talk to each other, don't leverage what is available, from other states and so on. So it's bound to happen. I'm surprised it's not happened yet. So, but we should be planning around these disruptions pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right now, I mean, the historical weather event essentially happening every other year, right? That even just last year in Oregon, we had major wildfire for about 2 weeks, and then right after that there was an ice storm, that power outage for another week or so, just right outside of Portland, Oregon. So definitely it's going to happen a lot more, and I think it really speaks to in the number one, it's the aging infrastructure for what we have today, but I really think that it's almost a mindset change where the infrastructure today is this very centralized infrastructure for grid, where I think as we're going to grow more and more into, it's going to be more microgrid, where renewables with storage and powering certain communities And that is going to be eventually be the way to solve a lot of these issues with severe weathers.
I think I see kind of 3, maybe 4 responses to the problem of kind of the twin problem of climate change and older infrastructure that Sarah and Julia mentioned. One is good old-fashioned grid hardening. We need to make the grid that we have more robust and invest in maintaining and refreshing that existing infrastructure. 2, we need more grid actually at the macro level. So I'd maybe push back a little bit against, Julia, your comment that microgrids will get us all the way there, particularly if we think we're going to rely heavily on wind and solar power to decarbonize. That means expanding the grid interregionally much, much more so than it is today, with the added benefit of interregional transmission expansion also makes the grid more resilient to problems in any one region. The third thing I think is microgrids and more distributed generation, more distributed backup, whether it's storage or small scale natural gas generation that's used infrequently but used when it's really needed. And the fourth thing that is sort of the oftentimes the redheaded stepchild of climate tech and clean tech, which is natural gas. It's too soon to give up on natural gas infrastructure. We're still going to need another way of delivering, another resilient way that's underground of delivering energy to consumers for a couple decades, potentially more to come. I could see a future for delivering gaseous fuel to end users, decarbonize gaseous fuel well beyond that. So I think investing in the gas grid alongside the electric grid is important to consider.
Very good. On to our next question. When do the panelists think that battery energy density per pound or per kilogram will overtake that of hydrogen fuel cell technology? I think in this case, we may be talking about lithium ion battery energy density per kilogram.
I think never. I think, in fact, even including the hydrogen pressure tank, the whole system of the, that's still like double the energy density of battery. So there is no way ever, I think, in terms of what hour per kilogram is going to catch up to hydrogen fuel cell. That's why I think for flying vehicles, hydrogen is a very good extended range, double the range of drones.
Yeah, and I agree. And I don't think you need to cross, because I think for vehicles, I think batteries are good options. We don't need to force fit hydrogen into everything. And I think batteries are in good shape. As much as I talk positively about hydrogen for steel manufacturing or even grid storage, I don't think it's the perfect solution. It's probably not a great solution for cars and so on. So it doesn't have to fit in everywhere.
Okay, on to our next question. Aside from recycling, which is an audience favorite, what about reuse? What are some major obstacles we need to overcome and to enable this?
Well, it's robotics, because right now the battery packs are at best semi-automatically disassembled. And even though many researchers do it in sort of at the lab scale, but really I've never seen a fully automated disassembly line, and that's yeah. So it's a very challenging issue. So I think with AI, computer vision, and robotics, that's the key advance we need for safe and fully automated disassembly of battery packs.
And I think if there are some best practices and standards that come into the picture, that might be better, because we do hear about people taking batteries from one industry, whether like vehicles, and trying to put it in the grid. This is particularly true in Asia market, where they don't have the standards. They're trying to repurpose the battery from one industry to another. And that leads to kind of explosions, unwanted consequences. So I think it's important to get it right, because there is obviously reuse is a huge potential. Because the cycle life requirements and performance requirements are very different between EV and grid, or if you want to use it for scooters or whatever.
Okay, on to our next question. As we see EV purchasing grow in various markets like North America, undoubtedly there will be a greater demand for energy to charge these EVs from the grid. How do we see this affecting the grid, and what can be done to effectively harness or get the energy from the grid to meet this growing demand?
I can take it. I think the grid infrastructure needs to be beefed up significantly, because now suddenly we are not only, there is more urbanization happening in many countries. I mean, I don't want to intentionally use US as the only reference, because this is a global question, right? So there's a lot of urbanization happening. There's a lot more, grid electricity congestion happening. So grid needs to be built out. So if I look at it in the extreme long run, if you have to increase the capacity of the grid, number one, you have to think about things like high temperature superconductors and stuff like that to be able to, and then there is a lot more infrastructure investment need to go to build out the grid similar to what is being done. And then third option is what we talked about, potentially things like hydrogen. So it needs to be a range of options that need to be considered to beef up the entire grid.
Yeah, I think in the near term, as we start to see EV load start to grow, probably in relatively high concentrations first in certain neighborhoods, right? Because there is going to be a higher concentration of EV adoption in some places than others. And so you'll see these little pops where all of a sudden on one distribution feeder, you might end up with, 10 new electric vehicles. And that's where you're going to start to see the problem first. And I think, the utilities and grid operators need to begin developing programs and software to at least manage some of the overnight charging that those vehicles represent, so that it can be smoothed out in any given part of the distribution system, which will at least buy a little bit of time to start making some of those really needed investments in distribution infrastructure. The thing I'd add in the long run is it's not just vehicles. I mean, another big sector that needs to be decarbonized, or end use that needs to be decarbonized, is building heat. And electrification is also seen as, I think rightly so, sort of probably one of the primary mechanisms for decarbonizing building heat. You end up with a peak coincident problem where at the same time people want to be charging overnight is also when it's coldest in the middle of the winter. And by the way, electric vehicles are less efficient in cold weather, so people are going to be charging more often. So we're going to see huge new peaks in the middle of the winter on just about every grid in the Northern Hemisphere, with the coincidence of electric heating and EV charging. So all that is to say, doubling down on that grid investment comment that Rajesh made. It's going to be a big area of investment that's needed.
Okay, on to our next question. What are the panelists' thoughts on what is needed to make the battery life cycle more efficient? What areas need the most help? Is it mining or managing aging batteries? Who would like to take this one?
Yeah, I can. So first, there are material innovations like pre-dissociation, electrolyte development, so where AI can play a big role, like we mentioned at the beginning. And then also software and battery management system is a huge help in optimizing, fast charging versus the cycle life. And so a lot to be done. But the good news is the cycle life is where you can really have nonlinear improvement. So unlike the energy density where 10% is a lot, there are actually many things you can do to double or triple the cycle life. And
I'm going to maybe take a contrarian opinion here and say, is cycle life really the problem we need to solve for? And I don't remember who made this comment initially, but maybe we need to really fundamentally go back to the drawing board and redesign batteries for end of life and reuse. And if we can, cost effectively extract all of the materials from these batteries and repurpose them into sort of the next iteration of resource, then we're substantially driving costs down. Cycle life becomes less of a driving factor.
Yeah, if we come back to the drawing board and if we, instead of optimizing for the energy density, but more for the cycle life, though, it's actually it's a much bigger bang for the buck. So it's actually quite easy to, through small changes, to improve the cycle life. And then you need less recycling. So because right now we really don't fully close the materials loop. So the recycling rate is only 10%. And even in the recycling that we do is incomplete. We still have loss of some lithium and there's loss of electrolytes. So I think the environmentally more benign thing to do if we are really designing new battery, of course, is make it easier to recycle at the end of life, but also to prolong the battery of the life. We need to do both, actually.
Okay, thank you. On to our next question. Are autonomous vehicles better than public transportation as a solution for the problem of too many cars on the road?
Why not have public transports that are autonomous vehicles?
What do the panelists think?
Well, why not autonomous public vehicles? I think it has privacy. I think from, for some people, if you're traveling with a family, I think, yeah, you can have autonomous public transportation.
Well, reality is you need both, right? People are not going to completely change their behavior. At the same time, we need to do the best we can to make as many things autonomous as possible. So it's really a combination of both.
It also depends what you're looking at for public transit infrastructure. I mean, if it's, primarily trains and light rail, that can, functionally be autonomous versus, buses and then moving into like taxi cabs and that kind of thing. So we're getting there in some areas already.
Okay, on to our next question. What do the panelists see as some of the major obstacles to the spread of e-mobility?
Well, resource limitation for sure. The EV is a much more mineral intensive than the traditional internal combustion engine. So it needs actually 3 times more copper than traditional vehicles. So it's going to put a huge burden on our mining and manufacturing sector, huge burden on transportation just to move the ores. It's going to be a huge ecological burden. So it has to be done right, I think. We have to think out about this really carefully.
And some of it is also around regulation too, right? Like let's expand the definition of e-mobility to include e-bikes and scooters. And, municipalities need to figure out how they're going to regulate scooters, especially and the sharing economy around those, and how do you, invest in bike lanes and other infrastructure for people to do this safely. I can just look at my own city, and there's been a massive explosion of e-scooters, both in terms of sort of delivery people for food delivery, but for folks to get around. With COVID, there was a dramatic decrease in people willing to take public transit, and maybe a vehicle didn't work for them because it was short haul trips or a cost barrier.
I think from a battery and infrastructure standpoint, I'd add, probably the biggest hurdle I think to mass market EV adoption is fast charging capacity in terms of both fast charging infrastructure and by fast, again, I mean at least 150 kilowatts and batteries that are capable of taking that charge, maybe not every day, but routinely without suffering tremendous degradation. I think if we get those two things, we get, and without sacrificing cost and some of the other key performance parameters, I'm not actually worried about density at this point, right? Like 300 miles, that's probably enough if you can count on fast charging when you need it.
On to our next question. How do we see eVTOL as a solution for e-mobility developing in various markets around the world?
God, I hope not. It sounds really annoying.
Rajesh, what are your thoughts?
Well, I missed the specific question about eVTOLs.
Yeah, how do we see eVTOL as an e-mobility solution growing in various markets around the world?
Yeah, I think it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, right? It's starting to take off. There are a lot of companies putting, the muscle behind it to make it happen. So it's a question of the geography and what are the first application use cases and how does that pan out. So if it's things like, delivery and cargo delivery and stuff like that, where people get warmed up to the whole concept of eVTOLs and then it takes off from there. Regulatory is obviously the biggest one in terms of, how soon that's going to happen. The battery life again becomes critical. So that's another critical area. So there are 3 or 4 things, but there's enough capital going into it, enough pain point to want a solution like this that will eventually make that happen.
Very good. Well, we've reached the end of our 30-minute Q&A discussion. This has been a remarkable session, and I think we can all agree that we learned extraordinary insights and are more excited about the future of energy than when we came in. I would like to give a huge thank you to our panelists in today's discussion. It was a pleasure having you join us, and thank you so much for all the deep insights into the exciting world of energy storage systems, e-mobility, and grid applications. For our academics doing research in related spaces, please reach out to Professor Hong Li and Professor Zhu Li. For our industry experts interested in energy storage systems, please reach out to Julia. For entrepreneurs looking to get help on starting their early stage companies or even their nonprofits, please reach out to Sarah, Andy, Veronica, and Rajesh. And thank you so much to our wonderful audience. Thank you for being so engaged and for keeping us on our toes with great questions. It has been my pleasure to host this session on energy storage systems, e-mobility, and grid applications. And we are looking forward to bringing more outstanding content on the cutting edge of energy innovation to you in the remaining sessions of TDK Ventures Energy Week. We would like to... Well, thank you. We would like to extend many thanks to our event partners who help support Energy Week. We're very grateful for your help and can't understate how important your support is for the success of the entire Energy Week. If you haven't already done so, please register for tomorrow's session on mining and battery recycling taking place this Friday. Please use the QR code on this slide to go straight to the registration page. Please invite other friends and colleagues to join as well. Today's session is now coming to a close, but we would like to give everyone the opportunity to continue to learn more about the topics we discussed. Please scan the QR codes to join groups on social media and contribute to this engagement on energy transformation even after this event concludes. If you would like to share more about Energy Week, please feel free to use hashtag Energy Week 2021 on LinkedIn. Thank you again to our guests and audience, and we hope to see you all at tomorrow's panel discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.